Amanda Helin is a gardener in the Gardens and Grounds team at the US Botanic Garden. She and her team are responsible for caring for the outdoor gardens, including the national and regional gardens, which are home to native plants from the US and the Mid-Atlantic. Amanda also cares for the terrace temporary exhibit beds, which are being incorporated into our upcoming agriculture exhibit to showcase agricultural plants. Amanda also has prior experience farming and as a head gardener at the Riversdale House Museum in Maryland, where she cared for a half-acre kitchen garden. Next is Kenny Silvera. Kenny is a plant specialist in the exhibits and displays team at the US Botanic Garden. He is responsible for exhibit design, including selecting, growing, and installing plants in US Botanic Garden exhibits. Kenny and his team are currently working on the interior scape for our upcoming agriculture exhibit, as well as starting plants indoors that will soon go outdoors in the kitchen garden. Today, Kenny's joining us from the garden's production facility in Blue Plains, DC, and we are thrilled to have both Kenny and Amanda here with us today. Welcome.
Hi.
So we are here to talk about spring vegetable gardening preparations. And so to do that, we're going to start out by looking at a few photos showing what's been going on here at the garden lately in terms of vegetable garden preparation. And again, as people have questions come up as we're talking, just type them in the chat and we will get to those shortly. Okay, and we're going to start out by hearing a little bit from Kenny. Kenny's doing a lot of the indoor growing. And so we have a few images here of what's been happening down at the production facility. So Kenny, talk to us about what we're seeing here.
So on the left, we have some freshly planted seedling trays. Everything that we plant for seed starting has to be in a nice, really fine media, just to help with moisture retention and, to give the seeds a good, good area for the roots to grow out in a more easier soil. So the left side is the plants that are kept in the propagation house. So we put them in there for about, a week to two to get things really just popping up. And as soon as we see those first cotyledons pop up, we bring them out into the warm greenhouse just to get them some full sun on them so they keep them shorter so they don't stretch out too much. The second picture is probably like I want to say a couple weeks after they've started, we pot them up into like a 4 or 5 inch pot to get them really filled in and get them ready to be planted outside. So we have, some larger plants, get ready to be planted out in the wild.
Great, thanks. And can you tell us some of the plants that you've started already in those pots?
Yeah, so for early spring, we are starting the cold season crops. So you have, like cabbages, broccolis, lettuce. What else? We started some borage. We started some chicory. So things like that want a cooler season. We would start that probably about mid-February to get them, ready to be planted out by now or by the end of March.
Great, thank you. And then we have a few images a little bit closer up. So can you talk about what we're seeing here?
Yep, here's some hyssop with some. This is probably a good, I want to say almost 2 weeks in, showing their true foliage after the cotyledons are underneath. So we have a couple true leaves coming up. So we'll probably end up potting those up into a bigger pot soon.
Great. And then here's another one of a summer crop. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yep, these are some cucumbers with their first cotyledons popping up. The cotyledon, which is the first leaf that pops up. Those will be put up into our hydroponics exhibit. So we wouldn't start those now for summer crops, of course. But like normally we would start cucumbers probably in early May just to get them popped up, to get them out into the gardens, because they have such a short window between they pop up and good time to plant them that you want to do it pretty quickly before you get them out.
Great, thanks. And then we have some examples of plants that are a bit further along and almost ready to go outside. Can you talk a little about the process, what we're seeing, and then the process sort of moving from indoors to outdoors?
Yep, so these are, you can see, I see borage, nasturtiums, and lettuce in the background. So these were the seeds that were probably planted, well, they were planted, mid-February. They've come along quite well. They've been bumped up probably 2 weeks ago into those bigger pots, and they would just put them outside under the shade cloth. So we want to get the plants acclimated to the outdoor weather. We don't want to put them in full sun yet. So we have a shade cloth out there that probably, I want to say it's like a 30% shade cloth. So it lets about 70% of the light in so they don't get burned. And then they just get more hardened off between the temperatures and the sunlight outside so they can be planted right in the garden without having any stress.
Great. Thanks, Kenny. And then this one is an image of sort of what a planting plan looks like for our kitchen garden. And so this is created by one of our other gardeners, Thomas, who does the design and a lot of the care for the kitchen garden. So he kind of comes up with what's going to go where for the spring, and then there will be a separate one for the summer and for the fall. And so you can start to see sort of how we transition from all the things happening in the greenhouse to planning out where everything's going to be positioned in the kitchen garden when it goes outside. And next we can go over to you, Amanda. Amanda's going to talk a little bit about sort of the outdoor portion of all of this. So this is an image of the kitchen garden right now taken. I think we took this photo on Monday, Amanda. Talk to us a little about what we're seeing in terms of bed prep and weeding and all that sort of thing that goes on at this time of the season.
So in the foreground here, you've got this beautifully prepared bed that Thomas has gotten ready to plant things in. He removed all of the weeds that had germinated there over the course of the winter. There's an example of a cool season weed that I'm holding that's flowering next to it. That's Veronica. I think there's actually a poppy seedling with it. So all of the weeds have been removed. In this particular case, we went through with what's called a broad fork. It's a mechanical tillage that is really gentle on the soil structure, and then smoothed it all out. So it's really pretty empty seed bed or for transplanting. Just behind that foreground of the nicely prepared soil, you can see the cold frame. That's part of our demonstration of season extension. And it's very importantly on that very sunny day that was Monday, propped open. The key with cold frames, you put them out there to keep things warm, but they can get really, really hot. If you look at a design for a solar oven and for a small cold frame, there's not a lot of difference. So when the sun is out and they're really warming up and the temperature is reasonable for just being outside, you really want to make sure that your cold frames are open and you're not roasting your cool season crops. The bed around that cold frame is mulched right now to keep weeds from coming up, suppress them a little bit. And next to it, you can see some crops that we can maybe harvest this time of year. Actually, I think there's another picture of those, right, Emily?
Yeah, so let's go to that. This is the close-up of the green that you were seeing in the background there.
Yeah, so this is chives, which are a wonderful thing to have in your garden. It's something that I think everybody can enjoy using. They're super easy in that they're just, you can just have them in your yard, in your landscape at your house. And pretty soon, or maybe in like a month, they have really nice purple flowers on them, and they will provide you chives that you can use like you would scallions or whatever. Throughout the year, you can just go out there and snip a few of them off. Just to the left of the chives, there are, I was going to say they're garlic chives.
Oh yeah,
they're a little bit different. They're frequently used like in Thai cooking. Mm-hmm. I think they're also called Chinese chives. I think it says on our sign. So that's another allium. There are a lot of onion family plants that are doing well this time of year and available to be harvested, including the next slide.
There it is.
Which has the planting of garlic, which is a little bit sparse, I've got to say. The seed garlic we used was not as good as it should have been. But this is what garlic looks like this time of year. Garlic is a fun one. I really enjoy growing garlic. So you plant it in the fall, just like you do with your ornamental bulbs, like tulips and things like that. And then this time of year in the spring, when there isn't a lot else going on, you have garlic. which you can harvest now as green garlic, which I think we have a picture of one I pulled, right?
Oh yeah, we do. There we go. Yep, there it is.
So it looks like a green onion, but it tastes like garlic. And this is like you would have taken a clove, just like you have off of your bulb of garlic in the grocery store, and planted it in the fall. And then this time of year, it'll look like this. And you can use that entire plant. It's got a nice garlic flavor to it. A little bit later, it'll flower. And usually people pull the flowers off because then they make bigger bulbs later. And then in late spring, early summer, you can harvest them for bulb garlic.
Thanks, Amanda. And then we have one more image here from the kitchen garden. You spoke a little bit already about the use of greenhouses and cold frames, but here's another one that we have in the kitchen garden where there's some arugula growing. So can you talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing here and some tips if people want to use this sort of a structure in the early spring?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a close-up and an inside view of the cold frame with arugula in it. And arugula is a plant that actually here could survive outside all winter on its own. If it's a particularly cold winter, it might burn a little bit and be slightly less pretty, slightly less appetizing. But with a cold frame, it can make it through even really the coldest months looking really nice, like these do on the plants on the right. The plants on the left that are like busting out of the cold frame there are starting to bolt, which means they're going to flower. And they're still quite edible, but once things start to heat up, either because you've left your cold frame closed on really sunny days, or just as the season progresses, a lot of these cool season plants will say, okay, I'm done. It's time for me to flower and move on. And they start being less sweet and often have more sort of bitter compounds in them that are chemicals the plant produces to keep things from eating it and its seeds. So usually you want to eat your crops before they start blooming and flowering like this. That being said, you can eat the arugula flowers and they're very cute. I do just want to mention the thermometer there is a soil thermometer, which if you want to get real precise about things is a great tool for starting seeds outdoors because all seeds have temperature ranges where they will germinate at all or more quickly. And the thermometer is a really helpful tool for that.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Stop sharing these photos. And we've had a few questions coming in as the two of you have been giving us the background. So thank you for that, just setting a little bit of context for where we're at this point in the season. So we will turn over to just going to people's questions and hearing some advice from the two of you. So Kenny, we have a few questions about indoor growing. Someone asked, is the optimal temperature low for hardening off plants?
So yeah, so what I normally do, so when it comes to, the spring crops right now, for instance, we start them off in the greenhouse and they're on heating pads as well. So it's probably about 70 degrees in there, especially on those heating coils. And for certain things like, the broccoli and the cabbage and kale, I will pot them up into a bigger pot, keep them in the warmer greenhouse for about a week until, they get a little bit more leaves on them. And then what I would normally do is we have one greenhouse that we usually keep cooler, but we didn't this year. And then I will actually grow them in that cooler greenhouse, which is probably, I keep it about like a 60, 65 degree day. And they love that temperature. And it even helps them, as they mature in those pots in there, it gives them an even better chance to get them outside, to get them going for that as well.
And then when you put them, when you put them outside, is there a certain like nighttime temperature or daytime temperature that's like too cold to do it, or what do you sort of watch for to make that decision of when it's time?
So yes, I'm watching for night temperatures in the low 40s. Even like the upper 30s, a lot of things can take it. A lot of those cold crops will be totally fine in those temperatures. Anything that's below, like, I wouldn't put anything outside at night below 36, 35, just because they're so young. And we don't want to get, any danger of frost. So yeah, I wouldn't put, if anything was like below, actually, honestly, I wouldn't do it below 38 even. Unless it's up against the house where it has that kind of warm spot. So yeah, so I'm mostly looking for nights in the low 40s, upper 30s, put it outside.
Great, thank you, Kenny. And then one more about seed starting indoors. Somebody said it's their first time trying this. How close should the lights be to the pots if they're using lights? And I guess a question is, are you using lights? And if someone is, how close should they be?
So we're not using lights, we're using the natural sunlight, which even this time of the year, they can kind of stretch quite a bit, even with that. I haven't actually used grown lights, but I've seen them like, a foot or two above it, because you want to keep the plants pretty low. You don't want to have that long stretched, you don't want to have a long stretched ceiling. You want to keep it pretty tight. So you can put them pretty close, like a foot or two away from it, as long as it's not too hot. Like the LEDs would be a great type of lighting for that because they don't get too hot. So I would do that. What do you think? Does that sound pretty good, Amanda?
Yeah, and if you're really just trying to get the seeds to start, you can put them really close.
Yeah.
And if you're using particularly if you're using like standard fluorescent lights that you might have at home, rather than like professional grow lights. I've actually started seeds before where like the lights and the top of the seed flats were really close together. And the lights
really close.
Were our source of heat too. But then you got to pay attention and move them out of there once they've started, like a couple days after the seedlings have popped. You want to move them to somewhere where they're getting better light, or somewhere that they're getting more light.
Thanks. And then we have one question about pests in the greenhouse. Someone asked, how do you prevent fungus gnats? Have you dealt with those at all?
Welcome to my life. So we just drenched today, actually. We use a nematode to help remediate that situation, because they'll attack the little worms or the maggots in the soil, which is a lot harder to do at home. And it's just tricky at home because you want to kind of have this balance where the soil's not too wet, but you also don't want to have it too dry, because as seedlings, you don't want them to ever dry out. So that one's a little trickier at home. I would just say try to keep it on the drier side, but not keeping it too wet, which is probably not the easiest answer. But yeah, they're always tricky at home. Like I always see that problem with a lot of people in their houses, because it's just hard to control inside.
Yeah, and even though they're kind of gross though, like if you only have seedlings inside your house for, I don't know, a month of the year, they maybe aren't going to be detrimental to the seedlings necessarily. Then you don't want to see them, like they're not enjoyable, the fungus gnats, but like, yeah, it's maybe not actually as big of a problem. And then if you say move all of your plants outside for the summer or something like that, they'll probably go away.
Yeah, someone was asking here about
you could use
yellow sticky traps.
I was going to say it'll help catch them. It won't help control them, but it'll help catch the ones that are flying around, just to knock some of them down.
Gotcha. We also have a question about outdoor critters. So how do you keep, any tips on keeping squirrels and chipmunks from digging up your seedlings once they're ready to move outside?
Oh man, yeah, urban gardening is
good luck.
pretty rough with the mammals. They're mammals, all kinds of mammals are trouble. I guess in general, what I would say about mammals is physical exclusion is really what you want. Like if there's some way to keep them out of the garden entirely, that's kind of the way to go. Particularly if you're talking about seedlings that are just like really small, and just if the squirrels happen to be digging up their acorns or whatever in the same area, they're just going to disturb them. There are some products that you can get that are like repellent. You do have to reapply them. Like there's stuff that you can spread on the soil that smells bad, that it's not really toxic. I think most of it actually has like cow blood in it, like things like that are not like scary chemicals, but are repellent to squirrels and things. So that's another option, especially if you've got sort of a small area.
Thanks. So a few other questions about preparing outdoors. Someone said they had an issue with damping off last year in one of their raised beds. Is there anything that they should do to the bed soil before replanting again this season?
There are some, they're referred to as fungicides, but they're organically approved products that you can drench the soil with. I would say probably, maybe Kenny has something to say about this, but damping off, your water management is probably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, watering is the main thing with that, the dampening off, because you don't want to have it too wet, and you also don't want to have it really dry, or then it gets too wet, because that can also cause that to happen as well.
Thanks. Here's another question about watering, and this one is around indoors. So Kenny, is it better to water seedlings from above, like misting them, or below, having trays with the water underneath?
I think either way would work fine. We water everything from above, but we're also in a greenhouse where we can get water everywhere. So I think honestly, either way would be totally fine. I don't think one way is better than the other, really. As long as you're getting all of the soil saturated, you know what I mean? Yeah, and you also don't want to have the plant sitting in a tray of water either, because that'll also promote more fungal growth, and you want to have any anaerobic situations happening. So, once you're watering seedlings in a tray, give it a little bit and then just dump out any excess water that's sitting there, because you don't want that to collect and cause any further issues.
Makes sense. Thanks. Another question about preparing an outdoor plot. Somebody, Amanda, asked, what's the optimal approach for preparing a plot for planting in terms of, should they turn the soil, how deep, amendments, composting? You want to talk about some of those details, things that the Gardens and Grounds team might be doing around this time?
Yeah, sure. So it does depend a lot on what you're starting with. Like if you have an area that is already a garden where you had vegetables last year, or even like annuals, and it's been amended in the past, that's a pretty different situation than if you have, say, a spot that is just lawn, turf grass to start with. Either way, I highly recommend knowing what you're dealing with to start with. A soil test is a great idea. You don't need to do one every year. So again, like if you did it last year, you probably have a pretty good idea of what's going on. But if you're starting a new vegetable garden in particular, because vegetables really, they want a lot of nutrients, they want a lot of sun, because they really want to like produce. So you want to make sure that you're not lacking anything really specific. So you can get a soil test really easily, send it usually to your extension service or something like that. It's like $15 maybe. And if you put vegetables on there and like what you're going to grow, they'll give you recommendations for what they think you should have. And then you find out if there's anything like weird missing, like you don't have any calcium, which would cause problems with your tomatoes later. As far as like how to prep the soil, so you have this information about what you need, and so maybe you have some specific fertilizers. But other than that, I highly recommend using a soil conditioner that's got a lot of organic material, like a composted fall leaves, or if you have home compost, throw it all in there. It's really hard to get too much organic material in a vegetable garden. And I personally really do not like sort of homeowner scale tillers. I think they're really terrible for the soil. I think it's much better to do like manual tillage with a shovel or a fork, or what I really like to use in an established vegetable garden is a broad fork, which is a big fork that you stand on that just sort of lifts everything up, lifts the soil up, fluffs it a little bit. So incorporating organic material is a really good idea. It's important not to work your soil when it's too wet, because that can really screw up the soil structure and cause you problems later. It'll, yeah, if you sort of do it when it's wet, it'll smash up the, all of the like little structures in the soil. And then once that soil will get really compacted later, and there won't be air, there won't be spaces in that soil for air and water that the plants need next to their roots. So yeah, aeration, organic material. Yeah, and I would also point out right now, make sure that you're getting on top of any weeds. There are, as the soil warms up, it gets to be the time when weed seeds germinate as well as vegetable seeds. So keep an eye on that.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Great tips. We have a related question that has to do with container growing. And someone said that DC gives away compost. Is that something that people could use in pots? Would you recommend that? And Kenny may have insight on that too.
So I've actually gotten some of that last year. It's very, the amount that I got last year was very barky. So I would say it would depend on the container size. So I wouldn't use it as just the soil to fill up a pot with. I would say if you have a really big pot and you just want to kind of like fluff it up a little bit, it would be okay for that. But as a general, like a smaller pot and just to use it just as soil, I wouldn't really use it as that. I think it would be too porous, and I think it wouldn't really hold nutrients as much. That compost from DC was great to really fluff up a lot of the clay soils that I was working with. So it really helped with that. So yeah, that's what I would. What do you think? Have you used it, Amanda, before?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. It's really barky, and it's a lot of mixed up weird stuff sometimes. And it's not really,
It's like
I don't think it's always the same type of, yeah, it's kind of like really fine mulch.
Huh.
But that was also the time that I got it, so that could change. Yeah, yep. So it could also change with the seasons. It could also be different, like when you get it one time as, you know, compared to like a couple of weeks later.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense, that there might be different things in it depending on how the municipal system was
Right.
using and grinding up things. So, and composting.
Exactly.
Great point. Another question about containers. Amanda, this might be a good one for you. Any first timer tips for container gardening with kids? Potentially interested in things like tomatoes, basil, carrots. Have you tried any of those in pots, and which are kind of easy starters maybe?
Yeah, tomato and basil probably maybe more than carrots, but if you have a deep container, you can grow carrots in a container. My big advice really for everyone for container gardening, and this is like, as a mom, this is my advice, containers need to be watered all the time, like every day. So keep that in mind if you're putting it with like how much time you have. And if you have little kids and you can give them a watering can and they're gonna go do that, maybe that's great. Like maybe that's something that they can do every day. But yeah, you're gonna set yourself up for failure if you're not gonna be able to water that pot every day. The other thing I would say about growing vegetables in containers is you really want a big container. I would say don't put a tomato plant in anything smaller than like a 5-gallon bucket. Or basil, you could probably get away with something a little smaller, but again, like the smaller it is, the more frequently you're going to need to water it. Like if you have yeah, if you have something that's smaller than a 5-gallon bucket outside in DC in the heat of the summer, and it's like getting enough sun to really grow something, you're gonna need to water it more than once a day. So keep that in mind.
Fried tomatoes.
Yeah. But if you're up for doing the watering, it is a super fun thing to do with kids. I highly recommend cherry tomatoes. Like my kids just eat all of them off the plant. Like there's no like harvesting, needing to bring them inside, kind of like very efficient process. They just like eat them all outside. Basil is a really good one because it's easy to grow in the summer and you can make it into pesto, or you can just let it grow there and be attractive if you don't feel like making pesto that week. And yeah, the thing about carrots, once it gets hot out, carrots start getting less delicious. they get a little bit more bitter. So planting carrots in the summer and then harvesting them in the fall is a really good way to go in the DC area because of the heat. Or if you plant ones that mature a little bit more quickly, that's a good container gardening way to go too. Carrots are pretty slow. They're slow to germinate. They're slow to get to an edible size. So if you're looking for more like immediate gratification, I would maybe go with radishes. Yeah.
Thanks. Someone else was asking about potatoes.
In containers or just in general?
I think in the context of containers, maybe they were saying it was fun.
You can grow some potatoes in a container. You know, you're not going to grow enough of them that'll like you'll make it through the winter on those potatoes, but they're a pretty fun thing to grow. And then like with kids or just because they're fun. We like, you know, adults like to have fun too. But yeah, we can dig them up and find the potatoes down in there. Potatoes can be a little bit tricky in this area. Again, the temperature, they're really like, oh, they grow in the Andes, like behind me, where it's much cooler. And they are typically planted, I guess you could plant them now, but they get all of the same diseases as tomato plants. So, you know, go for it, plant potatoes, but you may run into issues with fungal diseases and yeah, all sorts of insects that want to eat them too.
Thanks. Yeah, so we have a number of people talking about thinking ahead to their summer crops. So someone asked what plants for summer crops in the DC area work well, and when do you plant them outside? So maybe Kenny, you want to talk to us about some of the things you have started for summer or will be starting for summer, and then sort of what the timeline is going to be for having them go outdoors.
Yeah, so we're about to start. We should be planting this week, actually, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, things like that need a good head start first inside for a good few weeks. You want to plant them, I would say, you know, about 6 weeks before the frost. It's always hard to plant. If you have a little tomato seedling, you want to have one outside about like a good 6 inches. What do you think, Amanda? Like a good size for a tomato?
To go outside?
Like, yeah, I'd say about that.
At least that, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. See, anything warm season like that, I would start now, get them going. And then I would probably plant them outside about, you can kind of test it with the end of April. I think that's okay. Usually it's like a 1st of May, I want to say. I like to test things and then, you know, but then just in case you get a frost, you know, heaven forbid, but I would say the end of April is pretty close, the very beginning of May. And then with any squashes or pumpkins or cucumbers, I would just plant them directly in the soil. I wouldn't really start them outside. It's just much easier, and yeah, you have a better chance of like less root shock and stuff if you plant them right in the ground for those types of things. And that's also, again, like, you know, early May. You can do some for like, you know, a couple weeks into May too for those types of plants.
Yeah, this is a good thing that if you have a soil thermometer, or if at least you're thinking about the temperature of the soil, that's very useful. Like as humans, You know, we are tuned into the air temperature, and when it's nice out in March, it's like, woo, it's spring. But for germination, the soil temperature is what you really want to look at. Yeah, there are, anytime after like early April, it's not very likely here that we're going to get a frost. Like if you look at last freeze dates. So if you're really trying to push it, you can look at the weather report in April. But things that are like hot weather crops, like Kenny was just talking about, like tomatoes and cucumbers, are not going to do a lot of growing, even if you put them outside. But the last freeze date means they're not going to die unless it freezes. But you may want to wait until early May if you really want to make sure that often in seed packets it'll say warm and settled. Wait until the weather is warm and settled, and that's like sometimes people say Mother's Day, but yeah, like first week of May. And then when you get down into that range of just a couple of weeks, like look at the weather forecast and see how cold it's going to get at night.
Yeah, even some things, if you get them going really early and you plant out a larger plant, and then you have a smaller one you plant a couple of weeks later, that smaller one could catch up because the larger one just kind of sat there for a little bit. So there's no real rush, really. You just have to watch the temperatures.
Thank you. We also have a few questions about those chives and garlic and things that you showed earlier, Amanda. One question was about the chives. Was that, like when you see a clump of those, is that one plant? And sort of, can you talk about how they grow?
That is one plant, yeah. And they do reseed themselves. So if you have them in your garden, you might end up with more if you're not paying attention to removing them. But yes, each of those clumps was one plant.
And then we have another question about putting onion sets in raised beds. Can you do this? What's the best timing to do that?
So onion sets in raised beds, now is the time to plant onion sets. I'm going to warn everybody that growing onions at this latitude is actually kind of tricky, in that if you want to grow mature bulb onions, you really need to make sure that you have the correct variety of onions. Onions are really daylight specific, and like with a lot of things here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're in the middle. And so there are northern latitude ones and southern latitude ones, and some of each of them work here, but not by any means all of them. They and it's a weird thing that not everybody knows about onions, but they will not bulb up unless they get like the day length that they expect. So if you grow a northern variety here, it just will never make a bulb. It'll stay like a spring onion forever, no matter how long it's in the ground or whatever, because the days don't get as long as they get north of here. So, and what I have found is that the onions that are available as onion sets are often not the ones that are acclimated to our day length. So you can plant them and you can use them as green onions, as scallions, and that's great. Just don't be surprised if they don't turn into big onions. But yeah, plant them now. When I was farming, onions would be the first things that we would seed indoors in the spring, and we would do it like in January, and then they can go out in March even. Yeah, now.
Great, thank you. And we're almost here at the end of our time, so I think this is maybe a good one for us to think about to end with. Looking ahead, somebody asked, what can you plant in April? And they're thinking about, they're in DC, they're thinking about containers on a rooftop, but maybe the two of you want to think about like things you'd recommend for people in this area in the coming month to think about planting.
What have you got getting ready there for April, Kenny?
For April, we kind of have a little in-between middle thing where we have, we either have the March or we have the summer things. We don't really have any in-between stuff, because it's kind of a tricky one, because it's kind of that's like almost warm enough, but it's still cool enough to have cool season crops. It's kind of like in the middle of everything.
What do you have for April though? That would work for, I mean, what do you have for March? That's what I mean. Like there's lettuce.
Oh, for March, yeah, we have, yeah, I mean, you can like lettuce, of course. Even lettuce though is kind of tricky because you know how it can get. As soon as it gets warm, it just bolts and it's like, oh, that's done. But I would say like broccoli, cauliflower, kale would be a good one. So that'll keep going for a while. Maybe even if you wanted to try a cabbage, that could work. But I would plant that earlier than April though, just to get it up there and get it going. What else would you think? I think, Amanda.
Like you could direct seed like beets, radishes. Always you can always just eat them in a couple of weeks.
Oh yeah.
And, yeah. You can still plant lettuce.
You kohlrabi.
Go it way into the like hot weather, but eat it before that. You know, it's good when it's small, right? Like it's fancy then. Yeah, anything that'll germinate.
Peas would be good too. Give up peas and now let them grow, they'll die out.
It's a little late almost for peas here, but you can always eat the shoots too.
Nasturtiums are pretty.
Parsley, yeah, and nasturtiums are good because they're like in the middle, in between. Like,
yeah,
you don't want to freeze. Like they can't freeze, but they like the cool weather. Perfect time.
Right.
Great, good idea. Someone else was saying Swiss chard. That's a good one.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yep.
Great, and we had a few questions about lettuce and tomato growing indoors. So I want to direct people to a program we did about a little more than a month ago about hydroponic growing, and we can share a link to that in the chat too if people are interested in learning more about indoor growing and hydroponics, because that's a whole realm we didn't really dive into today, but a lot of interesting things to learn there too. So with that, I want to say thank you so much, Kenny and Amanda. This was really fun.